technologies. So today we're meant to be looking at, or the title for this webinar is Bolstering Your Defenses, and particularly we'll be focusing on incident response this morning. So today's webinar is meant to be part of a series, and this is the first installment in the series. So I'm sure most of us are familiar with what incident response is and what it stands for. And maybe you already have some form of incident response system already in place within your organization. So today we're just meant to look at the things we should expect out of a proper incident response plan or system, and how we can make it more difficult for threat actors to gain sustained access to our infrastructures. So for starters, why do we need to have an incident response plan in place? Or why do we even need to even look at incident response at all? So one of the things that has happened time and time again is that we've noticed that there's an uptick in the number of ransomware attacks. There have been a lot of changes in the way we've had to deal with ransomware attacks in today's IT infrastructure. So previously, maybe before the pandemic, it was a little bit easier to deal with all of these challenges because everything was always within maybe your premises or within your control. So it was easier for you to just maybe zero in on where a particular issue was coming from and just take it out. And then maybe from the period of the pandemic, where a lot of companies started to take a critical look at remote work, or were forced to adopt remote work systems, we started seeing other types of threats or loopholes creeping in. And then we also had to start looking for newer ways to protect the infrastructure that we have on ground. So on one hand, you had a system where previously everything was possibly behind your firewall. Now you have people who have access to maybe your Office 365 tenants, and there are a lot of things that are hosted in that environment. And you, as you're aware, for most software as a service products, so for most software as a service products, you are typically dealing with a shadow IT system where you know that there are servers or there are resources that are hosting this software that you are using, but you have no fundamental control over those resources. Of course, they will say, oh, as an admin, you have the ability to create social and so policies, but then it's still, despite the fact that you don't have full control over the infrastructure, so there are some things you might not be able to do, and you just rely on the company's promises to effectively secure their own system and all of that. So there's that, and then there's also people using maybe VPNs to connect to the office, or different means that we found for people to be able to still carry out their duties effectively. So aside just maybe having to deal with ransomware, I think ransomware is just one part of the picture. So another thing that we are also seeing is that there's the phishing emails, for example, like phishing has become seriously advanced, and some of the things that you possibly saw as stickers as to, oh, once I receive an email saying XYZ, I just know that it's a phishing email and all of that. Those things might not really work these days because the phishing emails are getting more sophisticated. I think last week there was a breach for MailChimp, and MailChimp is like a software as a service product. Is basically an email marketing tool that companies use to send emails to their users. So what happened in that incident was a number of company accounts were taken over by threat actors, and they simply used those emails or the accounts that they had gained access to spin off further attacks. So they were sending legitimate emails or emails that seemed legitimate because it was actually coming from the actual domains of all those companies. And they were sending emails from there to password and all of that. And then that was kind of what was happening. And it's still something that I think some companies are still trying to deal with. But that is one of the things that we also have to take into consideration to fully understand the type of challenges that we're dealing with now. So another thing that we've also seen is that the encryption rates has increased, and even compared to before, I'm sure we're all aware of the ransomware attack that affected one of the betting companies in Nigeria at some point this year. So it seems as if some of these things are shifting a little bit closer to home, more than we would have liked to actually deal with. So it's also important for us to begin to consider how we should respond to incidents and if we will be able to effectively deal with threats as quickly as possible. So aside all of, I think the summary of everything that I've said so far is that the numbers are increasing and there's a need to also be able to deal with all of that. So of course, many people have incident response plans, or they have like a thought process for what they think they would do when they have to deal with an incident. So the first thing we'll be looking at is the common mistakes that most people make in their plans or in their incident response system. So the first one is lack of context. So if you are waiting too long to react, one of the reasons why you may have waited too long is because you didn't know that maybe there was an attack in progress. So a number of times, before organizations are able to notice that, oh, we are actually facing an attack, maybe about 3 months have gone. So that is also a thing to factor in. So that's one hand of it. Then the other hand is you even knowing that, okay, there seems to be something off, but you're not sure how exactly to handle it. Then attacks coming at inopportune times. So imagine that you are off work, maybe as an IT person or as a cybersecurity specialist in your organization. You've closed from work and maybe you're at home and you wake up by maybe one in the morning and start seeing all manner of alerts. Between the time you left office and maybe that 1 o'clock, a lot of things could have happened. And even between when you're meant to resume work again the next day, a lot of things could have also happened. So another thing that we're also seeing for attacks now is that most times they kick off when you should have closed from work, because they are aware that a number of organizations do not have maybe this 24/7 security system in place. So they know, oh, these people close by 5 GMT plus 1, by 5 p.m. GMT plus 1, and just know that, oh, we can start by 8. So there's also the case of not having enough hands, or the people you have on ground being inexperienced or being overwhelmed altogether. The next mistake is declaring mission accomplished too soon. So there are a number of cases where, yes, people have handled incidents, even locally here, and they're like, oh, it's done, it's sorted, we are through with this. But another thing that's important to note is that the attacks that companies are facing now are not usually just one attack. So most times, if the threat actor is stopped, they would most likely kick off a different attack. So if they know it seems maybe RDP has been blocked, they might try to find another vulnerability within the network and most likely take advantage of that. And there was a report that was recently released by Sophos, where for a particular customer, they found that there were multiple threat actors in their environments at the same time. So you are dealing with one threat actor, maybe from one ransomware group, and another ransomware group is also trying their hands at your infrastructure. So that's another thing that we're beginning to see. Sometimes it might be that, oh, a software that was downloaded to a compromised system by one threat actor, another threat actor has a vulnerability that can be used, or an exploit that can be used against that particular software, and then you have trickles of attacks happening at the same time. So it's important for you to be sure as much as possible that you have cleared everything that represents the root cause for the incidents within your organization. It's also important that you are taking care of maybe other vulnerabilities that might have been created or backdoors that might have been created when this incident occurred. So as an example, we'll look at a snippet from one of Sophos MTR team case book. So we see that from day 1 to 3 was when the operators compromised a computer on the target network. So another thing that I also need to mention is now we have all manner of threat operations going on. So now you also have people who their job or who their role in this whole threat industry is to provide initial access. So there are people who are initial access brokers. So they just compromise a system and tell you, oh, we have so and so compromised systems within this organization. Pay so and so amount to gain access to those and so companies' infrastructure. So now it's becoming a common thing. So some people don't go ahead and do the full ransomware or exploitation. They just provide initial access and sell off to the highest bidder. So that's another thing that we're beginning to see. So from day 4 to 5, there seemed not to be anything really going on, and the attackers just kind of waited until weekend when they were sure that the security team wasn't going to be working, and then they kicked off the attacks. So the first attack was actually stopped, and then while Sophos team was still doing their investigation, they found out that there was another attack being launched again from another compromised account. And even when they had neutralized the threats, there was a third attempt again inside the virtual machine by the threat actor. So it's very important for you not to just close off the case as quickly as possible. So bringing us to the next item or the next mistake, which is relying on incomplete visibility. So as much as, of course, visibility is possibly the most important part of incident response, you can't fight or mitigate what you can't see. So you need to see as much as possible and see the full picture. So if I showed you a map and I showed you only one portion of the map and I told you, oh, XYZ is here, but you can't see any other portion aside that place, you might not even have a means or understand a means of getting to this portion of the map that I've given you without the other part. So as much as possible, you need to have the full picture. So you need to have the full picture of anything that's happening in your infrastructure at all times. So for the first step, you need tools that you could use to collect signals. You also need tactics and procedures for filtering through those signals and drawing a conclusion. So is there malicious traffic coming up from a user's system? Is it only that system? Is this traffic associated with a particular application? We have this particular application anywhere else within our infrastructure. What could possibly be triggering this application? Was it the end user who used it? Was it triggered by something else within the end user's device? So you need to be able to collect all of this information and make effective decisions. So, of course, with collecting a lot of information, there will come an issue, which is noise. So there tends to be maybe a lot of false positives, or the alerts become so much that the admin just decides, oh, there's no need to do anything. It's just the normal alert that we always get. And then there's also the implication of data collection and storage cost. So imagine you're pulling all this data from your infrastructure into a SIEM solution, for example, and then you look at it that, oh, this SIEM solution should be able to provide or cover XYZ. And then you also have to, and then they say, oh, this is how much storage you have using your plan. Maybe you need to pay, if you need an extra 200 gig, you need to pay so amount. And then when you also consider that you might need to have logs for maybe up to 6 months for you to most times get a clear picture of what is happening. So it's important that you also maybe factor in all of that and try as much as possible to make your log collection system as effective as possible. So for visibility, it's also important for you to have the right context. It's also important for you to have the right context, for you to be able to understand the context that relates to the information that you've been collecting. So you need to be able to pinpoint the real origin of an incident or the real origin of maybe an event that you've noticed that you're trying to investigate. You also need to be able to outline the potential business impact for that event. So there might be an event on maybe a server within your infrastructure, and you've seen that event and you're like, okay, what can possibly happen as a follow-up for this event, especially if maybe it has been identified as a malicious incident by the tool that you are using to collect your logs. So the fourth mistake is assuming that you can handle everything on your own. So from a survey that was conducted, 34% of the participants have said that they lacked or that skilled resources was their biggest challenge in dealing with incidents, whether it was determining the attack chain or the root cause of that incident. So having skilled resources was part of the biggest challenge, And then in another survey, 65% of IT managers said that they currently outsource some or all of the IT security efforts, and they're also we're also expecting, and then we're also expecting it to rise to maybe around 72% this year, and also still increase in the coming years. So we're also expecting, or the industry trend is also seeing an increase for money detection and response services. So for money detection and response services, you usually have a combination of human-led actions and maybe artificial intelligence in some cases to effectively help you detect possible indicators of compromise within your infrastructure and take care of them as quickly as possible. So picking a managed detection and response service might also be important to your incident response plan. So going back to the incident I shared earlier, from this diagram, you can see the timeline for the attack, or how long it took the MTL team to deal with the initial attack. So from here, you can see that it took 2 hours, 56 minutes for the initial attacks to be dealt with and closed off, which was even before they had found the subsequent attacks that were triggered after the first loop was closed. So having an MTL team or an MDL team that can effectively help you in this kind of incidents is also important to your organization. So we'll be moving on to the steps for an effective cyber security incident response plan. So of course, the most important step would be determining key stakeholders. So who are the people whose job or who should be involved in this process? So of course, for a lot of international organizations, it's not only the security or IT team that has to do with all of this. You would also need to loop in maybe your legal team or your public relations team. And from some of the actions that we're seeing being taken by the regulator in Nigeria as well, we are also expecting that in a few years, it should become compulsory for you to disclose cybersecurity related incidents as soon as they occur. So it's not only the security team you also have managers in order affected by your action. So if there are people who need to know that, oh, so and so server that you have running this application, we are planning or we are trying to figure out how to deal with an incident in case it occurs, and it would be nice for you to be part of the process. So you need to determine key stakeholders when you are planning your incident response. You will also need to identify critical assets. So MITRE has a very good guide for discovering your critical your critical jewels. I've forgotten the exact word they used to refer it to. So they have a guide for discovering which assets are critical to your organization and as much as possible should be shielded from external access. Okay, yes, I've gotten the name again. So it's crown jewel analysis. So MITRE has a guide for identifying which IT assets should qualify as critical assets, and also planning for how you protect those assets from attacks and threat actors. So the third part, or the third important part for incident response plan, would be running tabletop exercises. So as much as possible, you need to test that even this your plan that you have put in place will be able to take care of an event should it occur. So vulnerabilities within your infrastructure. So you need to have like a simulation where you can also test your organization's ability to defend against the event should it occur. So you need to ask critical questions like, was an attacker able to infiltrate? What tools or targets were used? What tools, tactics, and techniques were used? What was targeted? And was the attacker able to establish persistence? So most times, I think that's another critical part for the attacker. So as much as possible, one of the first steps that they try to take is being able to persist within your infrastructure. Because you could restart the server or device that they are connected to and they lose access, but they need to be able to persist and possibly laterally move across your infrastructure. So another sample scenario was maybe assuming that there was a successful breach and trying to figure out if you were able to figure out what data was removed and how it was removed. So it's also important for you to have all of that. And then another scenario would be testing what would have happened if the ransomware attack was successful. So I'm sure a number of us might already have a backup system for our critical assets, if not all the assets. And it's very important for you to be able to test whichever backup system that you're using, that you can restore your systems from those backups, and that those backups are probably airtight. And if there was an incident where maybe ransomware may have slipped through along with your backups, that you are able to remove the backup exactly. So you remove the malware in this case and still restore from that backup. So if in case maybe your current system doesn't cater to that, you need to start looking at a backup system that would allow you to have an airtight backup. So another important scenario to consider would be maybe if a high priority system is compromised, what are you going to do about it? What steps are you going to take to make sure that the business continues as soon as possible? So you would also need to factor in a business recovery plan into your incident response plan as well. So another key step is having adequate protection tools. So of course, we all have endpoints within our networks, and we all have a network, obviously, and we have servers. So are you able to protect the network, the endpoints connected to it, and the servers? If you have a cloud environment, how secure is your workload in the cloud? If you also have end users accessing critical company infrastructure using their mobile devices, are you able to also protect those devices? Are you able to also protect your email systems and detect when something goes wrong within a user's email and all of that? So of course, visibility, once again, you have to ensure that you are, as much as possible, that you are seeing the full picture and can understand the scope of the attack and the impact on your organization. Then implement access control. So if you haven't considered multi-factor authentication already, I think now is a good time for you to also start looking at that. And by multi-factor authentication, I don't mean click to allow. There's this other type of multi-factor authentication where a link is sent to the user to allow access. I don't think that has proven to be a sufficient way for companies to protect themselves. So I think the OTP system for now is still more reliable than having users click a link to authorize access to your system. So part of the reason why I'm saying that is for some of the recent ransomware cases or breaches that we've seen of recent, one of the causes that we are seeing occurring time and again is users getting sent links repeatedly to the point that the user gets tired and just clicks the link, and the threat actor or initial access broker is just granted access into your infrastructure. So you might want to consider that when also deciding how exactly you want your multi-factor authentication to work. Then it will be nice for you to sweep through your infrastructure and change all passwords that are still the default for the respective devices. So if you know you have maybe a Cisco device or any other, maybe Sophos device, any other device in your organization that is running with a default password, it would be nice for you to change it. And I think password 123 also counts as a default password in this case, because a lot of people also use that for critical access because it's easy to remember and they know that they won't forget it. But threat actor also knows that people like that exist and they love password 123 a lot. So another thing you should also look at is limiting admin privileges. So it might also make sense for your organization to tier admin privileges. So because someone is a member of the IT team doesn't mean that that person should have access to everything, to every part of the infrastructure. So for some team members, there might be a need for you to limit their privileges or take advantage of one of the best practices, which is this access privilege, where people are given as much privilege as possible that will allow them to perform their duties. So as little privilege as possible that will allow them to perform their duties. So if somebody is only in charge of some group of servers, it might be a good idea for you to limit the person's admin access to just those servers or to the scope of the person's work within the organization. Another thing that would also make sense for you to look at is reducing the number of access points into your network. Reducing the number of access points into your network. So if you have VPNs and all of that, it would be nice for you to restrict as much as possible the resources that users would have access to and the things or the actions that they can take using VPN. It would also be a good idea for you to consider disabling unused ports within your organization. So if you know that there are ports who nobody uses, yes, those ports are already available, but nobody uses them. So you could disable them. If the need ever arises, you could always go back and enable that port back. But for the time being that nobody is using it, it is a very good idea for you to disable it. I don't know whether there's any question at this point or I should go ahead. I think I'll go ahead. So invest in investigation tool. We've talked about visibility and how important it is to your organization for the security teams to be able to see a clear picture or see the full picture. So it's also nice for them to also have, or it's important for them to also have the necessary tools they can use to also investigate the information that is being collected. So it could help analysts to pinpoint compromised assets and could also help determine the attack scope or impact. So if you had a tool that could chain events together so that you could actually see the steps or the processes for those events to occur and possibly take care of all of them, or discover all the other assets that may have been compromised from the first system that you detected. So another important reason for having proper investigation tools is that when there are new vulnerabilities that are released to the public, you could quickly make use of those tools to scan across your infrastructure to determine if you had something like that as well within your infrastructure, and to also make your team to be able to quickly deal with vulnerabilities and take care of them as soon as possible. So you would also need to establish or have an established response action. So how exactly do you intend to deal with that issue? Or how exactly do you deal with an incident within your infrastructure? So you need to have maybe a guideline for members of the team so that anybody can just quickly follow that guideline and ensure that the threat was closed off properly. So whether it's to isolate the affected host, block malicious files, processes, programs, block C2 and malicious website activity, freeze accounts that have been compromised, or remove the rights pending when you have taken care of the issue, even if you need to make adjustments to your configuration. So all of that needs to be part of your response actions. And it would be nice for you to have it documented where any member of your team can always quickly go to it and make reference. Then another important part is to conduct awareness training. So it's also important for you to help your end users understand the type of threats that they are dealing with, and also help them to know that they also have a role to play, and it's not just down to maybe the IT team or the security team to deal with anything that happens. So your end users also need to be able to know or have certain knowledge of their roles within the organization. So another thing that we're also currently doing is that for our customers, we are actually offering a cybersecurity awareness training for all organizations that are our customers, to help them better enlighten their end users on the threats that companies are facing today. And of course, we hope that the users would also take back that knowledge and apply it effectively within the organization. So the next step, or the last part of a good incident response plan, is that you would also need to consider hiring a managed security service. So I think we've reached the point where it is important for organizations to be able to have access to skilled professionals and 24/7 security. So in summary, the 10 steps for your plan would be to determine your key stakeholders, identify critical assets, run tabletop exercises, deploy tools to protect the assets within your organization, ensure that you have maximum visibility into what's happening in your organization, and implement access control. So implement access control, invest in investigation tools, establish response actions, conduct awareness training, and hire a managed security service. So I don't know whether there are any questions at this point. Are there any questions? So if there are no questions, we have come to the end of this webinar, and we would like to collect feedback as well. So there's a link to a short survey that was dropped in the chat box. It's actually a 30-second survey. So we just want you to quickly fill it to help us get feedback.